Within this framework, then, the problem with economic growth and capitalism is not only that it's crisis-ridden, rather the form of growth itself is problematic. The trajectory of growth would be different if the ultimate goal of production were increased quantities of goods rather than surplus value. I have a paragraph saying that there's also an analysis of the form of production in capitalism itself, not as a technical process which is controlled by capitalists for their own end, but rather the material form of production itself is molded by the social form of capital. What is generated, I repeat once again, that the logic of Das Kapital indicates that for Marx, the abolition of capitalism would not entail the self-realization of the proletariat, but its self-abolition. The class, if you take Marx's value analysis seriously, the class without which capital cannot exist is the proletariat. It's not the bourgeoisie. Marx develops this argument and the non-linear nature of development further in his treatment of accumulation, in which he argues that capitalism's drive for increasing productivity generates a long-term tendency towards increasing the proportion of objectified science and technology relative to living labor. A long-term consequence of this tendency is that less and less labor is required for higher levels of productivity based on newer production processes. One result is a tendency for the creation of a relatively superfluous working population, the so-called industrial reserve army of labor. Now, this analysis traditionally has been read as an account of how capitalism exerts downward pressure on wages. Relatedly, it has also been taken as a critique of capitalism's inability to provide full employment. This reading, however, is incomplete. It misses an important thrust of Marx's argument, and hence its relevance for today's crisis. Marx's chapter on accumulation should be read as the culmination of his argument that the long-term tendency of capital's drive for ongoing increases in productivity is the development of a technologically sophisticated productive apparatus that renders the production of material wealth essentially independent of value, that is, of direct human labor time expenditure. However, because value is constantly reconstituted as the basis of the system, the growing superfluity of labor begins to take the form of the growing superfluity of an increasing large portion of working populations, of an increase in the permanently unemployed and the precarious, the underemployed. This development goes far beyond periodic expansions and contractions of the industrial reserve army with its downward pressure on wages, and it calls into question the demand for full employment as the solution to capitalism's problems. Rather, it expresses in inverted form the growing superfluity of much proletarian labor. Far from appearing as a linear possibility then, the possibility of the abolition of proletarian labor, and hence the emergence of the possibility of a future in which surplus production no longer must be based on the labor of an oppressed class, is at the same time the emergence of the possibility of a disastrous development in which the growing superfluity of labor is expressed as the growing superfluity of people. In other words, the possibility of a future is at one and the same time the emergence of the possibility of an unbelievable level of barbarism, and the two are tied together. It's become evident, considered retrospectively, that the social, political, economic, cultural configuration of capital's hegemony has varied historically. From mercantilism through 19th century liberal capitalism, 20th century state-centric capitalism, to contemporary neoliberal global capitalism. Each configuration has elicited a number of penetrating critiques of exploitation and uneven and equitable growth, for example, or technocratic, bureaucratic modes of domination. Each of these critiques, however, is incomplete. As we now see, capital cannot be identified fully with any of its historical configurations. Now, one of the reasons why my talk has been as abstract as it has is I am trying to differentiate between approaches that, however sophisticated, ultimately are critiques of one configuration of capital, and an approach that would allow for an understanding of capital as the core of the social formation, separable from its various surface configurations. The distinction between capital as the core of the social formation and historically specific configurations of capitalism has become increasingly important. Conflating the two has resulted in significant misrecognition. I'd like you to recall Marx's assertion that the coming social revolution must draw its poetry from the future, unlike earlier revolutions that focused on the past, misrecognized their own historical content. I want to suggest that too much social critique looked backwards. In this light, traditional Marxism backed into a future it did not grasp, sort of like Benjamin's angel. Rather than pointing to the overcoming of capitalism, it entailed a misrecognition that focused entirely on private ownership in the market, conflated capital and its 19th century configurations, and consequently, it implicitly affirmed a new state-centric configuration that emerged out of the crisis of liberal capitalism. The unintended affirmation of a new configuration of capital can be seen more recently in the anti-Hegelian turn to Nietzsche, characteristic of much post-structuralist thought since the early 1970s. Such thought arguably also backed into a future it did not adequately grasp. In rejecting the sort of state-centric order traditional Marxism implicitly affirmed, and on that basis criticized Marxism, it did so in a manner that has proven to be incapable of critically grasping the neoliberal global order that has superseded state-centric capitalism east and west. The historical transformations of the past century, then, have not only revealed the weaknesses of much traditional Marxism, as well as of various forms of critical post-Marxism, but also suggest the central significance of a critique of capitalism for an adequate critical theory today. By attempting to rethink Marx's conception of capital as the essential core of the social formation, I am trying to contribute to the reconstitution of a robust critique of capitalism today that, freed from the conceptual shackles of approaches that identify capitalism with one of its historical configurations, could potentially be adequate to our social universe. Thank you.